Before he could even read, he was learning to wield a sword. By 7, he was wrestling grown men. By 14, he was trained to kill without hesitation. And by 21, he was ready to die for a code he didn't write. Behind the shining armor and tales of honor was a brutal, lifelong transformation, one that turned a boy into a weapon. This is not the story of chivalry. This is the making of a medieval killer, a knight forged in blood, pain, and obedience. In the medieval imagination, the knight stood tall as a symbol of honor, faith, and courage. Draped in chainmail or plate armor, mounted on war horses, carrying banners that bore their heraldry, they looked like defenders of virtue. But the image was a carefully constructed facade, one that often concealed a far more brutal foundation. Knighthood was not born out of idealism. It evolved from necessity. As Europe fractured into feudal territories following the collapse of centralized Roman rule, warfare became constant. Lords needed men who could fight, lead, and, if required, kill without hesitation. The solution was the knight, not as a gentleman warrior, but as a militarized landholder trained for violence. From the 9th to the 15th century, knighthood spread across Europe, formalizing the warrior class into a pillar of feudal control. These men were not mere foot soldiers. They belonged to the social elite. To be a knight was to be of noble birth, or at least to be wealthy enough to afford war horses, armor, and retainers. The cost of equipment alone could exceed the yearly income of dozens of peasants. In return, knights received land, income, and status, often tied directly to their willingness to fight and kill for their liege lord. But alongside this martial reality emerged something more complex, the ideal of chivalry. By the 12th century, influenced by church reformers and literary traditions from Occitania and northern France, the image of the knight began to change. Now, knights were expected to uphold a code, to protect the weak, to show mercy, to serve justice, and to act with honor in battle. The chansons de geste and Arthurian romances fed this narrative, creating legends that bore little resemblance to the battlefield in practice. Knights often served as enforcers of brutal local authority. Their raids devastated peasant populations. In many cases, they extorted, pillaged, and burned villages in service of rival lords or religious causes. The same knight who swore to protect the church might be found looting it during a civil conflict. The contradiction was never fully resolved. The code of chivalry was aspirational, rarely enforced, and frequently ignored. The First Crusade, in 1096, exposed this divide in full. European knights, supposedly fighting for Christendom, slaughtered entire cities, including Christians in Constantinople and Muslims in Jerusalem. Chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres and William of Tyre documented not just the piety of crusaders, but also the unrestrained bloodshed. These were men who could pray in the morning and massacre by nightfall, with both acts viewed as part of the same divine mission. The Church attempted to regulate knightly violence through movements like the Peace and Truce of God, but success was limited. By the 13th century, even tournaments, originally designed as chaotic, deadly rehearsals for war, were sanitized into pageants to mask their origins. To understand how a child was trained to kill under the banner of chivalry, one must start here with the uncomfortable truth that knighthood was forged through systemic violence, wrapped in a myth that made it socially acceptable. The training didn't begin in innocence. It began in a world that needed killers, but preferred to call them noble. Knighthood was never offered freely. It was inherited, calculated, and often demanded. Not every child in medieval Europe had access to the training required to become a knight. In fact, most didn't. The path to knighthood was closely guarded, restricted to those born into privilege, the sons of lords, barons, and landholding nobility. It was as much about blood as it was about ability. By the 11th century, knighthood had evolved from a loosely defined warrior role into a codified institution tied to feudal landholding. Knights were vassals, part of the machinery of territorial control. Their value wasn't just on the battlefield. It was economic and political. They collected taxes, enforced their lord's authority, and protected property. To be trained as a knight was to be groomed for a life of violence in service of power, but only if the boy came from the right lineage. Noble families treated their sons as assets. A firstborn son was expected to inherit land and titles, but even younger sons held value. Sending one to be trained as a knight was both a duty and a strategy, a way to extend influence, earn income through military service, and align with more powerful houses. The training wasn't seen as optional. It was imposed from birth. Infancy for a noble boy was not about play or discovery. From the moment of birth, he was raised under the weight of expectation. Wet nurses, tutors, and servants surrounded him, but affection was secondary to preparation. Early lessons revolved around obedience, posture, and control, not curiosity. By the time he could walk, he was already mimicking martial gestures, learning to bow, to sit properly, to speak when spoken to. The child's body and mind were being conditioned to follow orders long before he held a sword. These boys weren't raised for personal fulfillment. They were bred to perform a role. If a noble father served in war, his son would be expected to follow. If the family was expanding, its influence through military alliances or marriage ties, a knightly son became a bargaining chip. His training was an investment, one that could pay dividends in land, favors, or prestige. From around age 5 or 6, these children began handling wooden weapons. They were taught the names of famous warriors, the codes of heraldry, and the lineage of their house. By age 7, most were sent away to another lord's household, beginning formal service as a page. But even before this point, their identity was shaped by the assumption that they would one day fight. There was no alternative career path, no space for doubt. Knighthood wasn't a passion, it was a duty predetermined by birth. The entire system depended on this continuity. Without sons trained to kill, the feudal order would collapse. Castles needed defenders, borders needed enforcers, and noble families needed loyal blades they could trust. That trust didn't come from character, it came from bloodlines, and the training that began before a child understood what it meant to be free. At the age of 7, a noble boy's life changed permanently. He left his family home, often for years, and entered the household of another lord. This was not an act of exile, but of tradition. To become a knight, a boy had to first become a page, and that meant stepping into a world built on hierarchy, violence, and control. The household he entered was not a school in the modern sense. It was a functioning military and administrative hub, complete with retainers, guards, servants, scribes, and craftsmen. The boy's training would be constant, though rarely formal. He was expected to observe, serve, and absorb the customs of power. Pages waited on noblewomen, helped serve meals, and delivered messages. They learned humility through subservience, but the real purpose was deeper, to strip away the softness of youth and replace it with discipline. Pages were trained to endure physical discomfort early. Wrestling was a regular exercise, not just to build strength, but to instill toughness. Running, climbing, and horseback riding were expected, not as sport, but as foundational skills for war. Riding, especially, was crucial. A knight who couldn't control his horse in combat was a liability. So the training began when the boy's legs could barely grip the saddle. Weapons training started soon after. At first, with wooden swords, staves, and shields. The exercises were repetitive and harsh, striking at straw targets, practicing footwork, learning the weight and balance of blades. Even small mistakes earned sharp reprimands. In many households, older squires or knights conducted the training with little patience. Bruises were normal. Blood was not uncommon. Hunting was another form of preparation. A page would assist on organized hunts, tracking boars, deer, and birds with dogs and falcons. It was more than aristocratic leisure. Hunting trained the boy's hand-eye coordination, instincts, and comfort with death. Killing was normalized through ritual. The psychological conditioning was just as deliberate. The page was constantly reminded of his place in the hierarchy. Shame was a tool. Public reprimands, enforced silence, withheld privileges, all were used to forge obedience. Punishments could include physical beatings, isolation, or labor. These were not acts of cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were designed to erase hesitation and foster submission traits needed for a soldier who would one day obey orders without pause. The social structure of the castle reinforced everything. Pages ate after others, stood in the background, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. They watched as their lords made decisions of life and death, negotiated with rivals, and prepared for battle. Through exposure, the boy was being shaped not just into a fighter, but into someone who understood power, how it was wielded, maintained, and inherited. By the time a page approached his teenage years, he had already been immersed in a culture of controlled violence, rigid discipline, and unwavering loyalty. He had been taught to revere authority, to mask pain, and to expect hardship. The child who arrived at the castle was no longer visible. What remained was a candidate, not yet a knight, but no longer a boy. At 14, the boy became a squire. His role shifted sharply, no longer a quiet observer, but now a direct participant in the machinery of war. If the life of a page was obedience and discipline, the life of a squire was proximity to violence. It was here, under the shadow of real combat, that the transformation into a knight truly accelerated as a squire. He was assigned to a specific knight, often one with battle experience, sometimes a relative, but just as often a hardened stranger. This mentor would shape him with direct instruction, brutal repetition, and little tolerance for error. The knight trained the squire, not in theory, but in the habits of survival, because real battles didn't reward idealism. They punished. Hesitation. Combat training intensified. Swordsmanship moved from wooden swords to blunted steel. Squires drilled relentlessly, footwork, blocking, striking. They practiced against live opponents, learning to read movement, to exploit hesitation, to strike through fatigue. Injuries were expected, bruises, dislocated fingers, broken ribs. It wasn't sport. It was rehearsal for death. Jousting entered the routine. Though tournaments offered a more structured environment, jousting itself was never truly safe. Blunted lances still shattered bones. Squires trained to control the war horse at full speed, to angle the lance with precision, to fall without panic. The chaos of mounted combat was part of the process, a simulation of the melee they would face. In war dock close, dash quarters drills followed. Armored combat, slow, suffocating, punishing. Chainmail weighed 20 to 30 pounds. Full plate, which emerged later in the 14th century, added even more. Training in full gear was exhausting by design. The squire had to learn how to breathe, move, and kill inside a metal shell. But the most sobering part of this stage wasn't training, it was exposure. Squires accompanied their knights into real campaigns. They were not frontline fighters, but they were present, carrying shields, tending horses, maintaining armor, delivering messages under fire. They watched men die. Sometimes they had to finish the wounded. Sometimes they had to stand motionless, while chaos erupted around them. This wasn't rare. From the 100 Years' War to local feudal skirmishes, campaigns gave squires their first real contact with war's human cost. Discipline was enforced constantly. Mistakes were punished, sometimes physically. A squire who failed to secure a strap, clean a weapon, or follow a command could be humiliated or beaten. The mentor knight held absolute authority. In some cases, historical records suggest the relationship was abusive, emotionally or physically. But this too was considered part of the conditioning. A knight had to be hard, and that hardness was built through suffering. Loyalty was drilled in not just to the knight, but to the feudal system itself. The squire learned who he served, why obedience mattered, and where he stood in the chain of command. He was reminded, often through brutal clarity, that the knight was not a free agent. He was a tool of his lord. And the squire would become one too, by the time a squire neared his 21st year. He had not only learned the mechanics of combat, but had also internalized the role he was expected to play. He was no longer training to be a warrior. He already was one. What remained was the final ceremony, the formal transition into the knightly class. But by then, the title was only a formality. The transformation had already taken place. The code of chivalry is often remembered as a noble standard, a moral compass for medieval knights, built around honor, mercy, loyalty, and justice. But in practice, it served less as a moral guide and more as a political tool. What knights were told to be rarely aligned with what they were required to do by the 12th century. The church and secular authorities recognized a problem. Knights, heavily armed, trained killers, were unpredictable. Their loyalty was tied to individual lords, their behavior shaped by feuds, revenge, and ambition. So the church began promoting the idea of chivalry as a means of control. The peace and truce of God movements, launched in the 10th and 11th centuries, were early attempts to limit knightly violence, forbidding attacks on clergy, women, peasants, and church property. But enforcement was inconsistent, and violations were widespread. The literary version of chivalry emerged not from the battlefield, but from courts and monasteries. Texts like the Song of Roland and Chrétien de Troyes, Arthurian romances, painted an idealized picture, the knight as a selfless protector, humble servant, and moral exemplar. But these stories reflected aspiration, not reality. They were composed for court audiences, often by people who had never seen war, and served to polish the image of the warrior elite in the real world. Knights often operated far from any code. During the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, knights loyal to the church massacred entire populations in southern France, including non-combatants in the name of orthodoxy. The infamous phrase, "kill them all, God will know his own," attributed to papal legate Arno Amaleric during the sack of Béziers in Yarling-Joe, captured the raw brutality masked by pious rhetoric. This wasn't an exception. It was the system, working as intended. The contradictions were embedded in the code itself. Mercy was praised, but only toward those of equal rank. Common soldiers, civilians, or enemy cultures were given no such protection. Knights were taught to honor oaths, yet were also expected to obey without question, even when orders involved torture, execution, or betrayal. The same code that promoted restraint also demanded absolute loyalty to a liege lord, even if that lord's war was unjust or merciless. Chivalry wasn't a shield for the weak. It was a narrative, a way for the ruling class to legitimize violence, discipline their own knights, and sell the public on a system that rewarded war with land, title, and glory. Knights were not free agents of justice. They were assets, and the code of chivalry was the branding that made them appear righteous. The ideal may have persisted in poems and pageantry, but on the ground, in the mud and blood of real conflict, the code was optional, sometimes ignored, sometimes weaponized, but rarely lived. The path from squire to knight ended not with a battlefield victory, but with a ritual, the dubbing ceremony. In its most formal version, it was steeped in symbolism. A religious vigil, a night of prayer, a consecrated sword, and the laying of hands. The squire, having served for years under the weight of training, discipline, and obedience, was now publicly declared a knight. But the pageantry masked a harsher truth. This was not the beginning of duty. It was the confirmation of submission. The Church's influence on the ceremony was deliberate. In the High Middle Ages, particularly from the 12th century onward, ecclesiastical authorities worked to spiritualize knighthood. The goal was to give divine legitimacy to warfare. Before being dubbed, a squire was often required to fast for 24 hours. He would then take part in a vigil, sometimes overnight, inside a chapel. There, he stood or knelt in silent prayer before the altar, often accompanied by the sword he would carry in combat. This ritual was meant to cleanse the mind, to reinforce that his blade now served Christian kings and causes. But for many, especially in later centuries, it was more theatrical than transformative. The pressure to display piety often outweighed any actual religious conviction. When morning came, the ceremony moved into the public eye. Nobles, clergy, and family members gathered as the squire was clothed, sometimes in symbolic colors, white for purity, red for sacrifice, black for death. A respected knight, often his lord or mentor, performed the dubbing. The act itself varied. In some regions, it was a light tap on the shoulders with the flat of a sword. In others, it was a hard blow to the neck or face, a strike meant to be remembered as the last physical blow the knight would receive without retaliation. But not all were knighted through ceremony. Many were dubbed on the battlefield hastily, without ritual. In the chaos of war, when squires had proven their courage in combat, commanders conferred knighthood on the spot. These battlefield knightings stripped away the religious trappings and focused on the function. This man had killed in service, had not fled, had shown loyalty. That was enough. Tournaments also served as proving grounds. Emerging in the 11th century and spreading widely by the 13th, tournaments were not games. They were violent spectacles. In early forms, the melee, a mass-mounted brawl, was indistinguishable from real warfare. Squires who survived and impressed might be knighted by noble patrons. In these cases, knighthood was a reward for performance, not virtue. What mattered most was not the sword, the prayer, or the audience. It was the shift in identity. The boy who had been molded through servitude and the young man trained in obedience had now become something more permanent, a legal and cultural weapon. Knighthood granted him the right to bear arms, to fight under a banner, to lead men in battle, and to exact violence in the name of law or lordship. The transformation was not physical, it was psychological. The ceremony made it official, but the real change had already occurred. Years of conditioning had produced someone ready to kill, and convinced it was honorable. Combat training for medieval knights didn't resemble modern military academies or sports schools. It was brutal, chaotic, and designed to desensitize. The goal was not fitness or athletic glory, it was survival in close quarters, killing a reality knights. Faced repeatedly in the feudal and crusading wars of Europe and the Levant. Mock battles were common, but they were never truly safe. Melees, the centerpiece of early tournaments, involved dozens or even hundreds of mounted and unmounted fighters clashing with blunted weapons over open fields. There were few rules. Participants could be unhorsed, dragged to the ground, or even trampled. By the 12th century, these tournaments had become training grounds for real warfare. Noble families sent their sons into the fray, not to entertain, but to test them, to see if they could endure the confusion, the fear, and the violence. While swords and lances were often blunted, injuries were constant. Concussions, shattered limbs, punctured lungs. Chroniclers, like Orderic Vitalis and William Marshall's biographer, recorded numerous deaths during such events. Some were accidental, others weren't. In an era where feuds and honor disputes simmered just below the surface, a training ground could easily become a pretext for revenge. Boar hunts were another form of lethal instruction. They weren't leisurely pursuits. The wild boar was considered one of the most dangerous animals in Europe. Armed with spears and often mounted, knights in training faced a creature that could charge, gore, and kill. Hunts taught how to strike under pressure, how to remain calm in the presence of blood, and how to read terrain while in motion. They also reinforced dominance over animals, nature, and fear itself. Sparring was frequent and unforgiving. Young knights trained with blunted weapons, swords, axes, maces. Protective gear was minimal, sometimes just padded jackets or leather gloves. Helmets were used, but even then, serious injuries were common. A misplaced blow could shatter a nose, split a skull, or break ribs. But these injuries weren't treated as failures. They were lessons. Bruises faded. Pain was temporary. Weakness in battle was permanent. Knights also practiced fighting in full armor, often weighing 40 to 60 pounds, training in plate or mail. Tested endurance and mobility. Every movement became slower. Every strike drained energy. They learned to control breathing, to manage exhaustion, to keep balance while charging or falling. It was less about elegance and more about conditioning the body to endure suffocating metal in hours long. Engagements, there were no safe spaces in this training. No simulations. Real wounds were the curriculum. Real blood was the marker of progress. A knight untested by violence was seen as unfit, not just by his peers, but by his lords. In the eyes of the feudal system, a knight who had never shed blood, never been broken in combat, was a liability. Training didn't end after knighthood. Even experienced warriors continued to drill, hunt, and fight in tournaments to keep their edge. The battlefield offered no forgiveness, and medieval society, built on conquest and control, demanded warriors who didn't just know how to kill, but who were comfortable with it. Knighthood was not a symbolic title. It was a full-time profession rooted in warfare, violence, and control. Behind the ceremonies and courtly gestures stood men who were, above all else, professional soldiers. Their lives revolved around training, not to impress, but to stay alive and to stay useful to the lords who paid them. In the feudal order, a knight's value was measured by his readiness to fight. Peace was fragile and rare. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, Europe was in near-constant turmoil. Regional wars, inheritance disputes, rebellions, and border skirmishes offered a steady stream of conflict. When large-scale war subsided, tournaments filled the gap, violent displays that were part sport, part military rehearsal. They helped maintain readiness and served as public demonstrations of power and dominance for lords and monarchs. Knights were military assets. In return for land or income, knights provided military service, not occasionally, but on demand. This included field campaigns, garrison duty, suppressing revolts, or simply appearing fully armed and mounted when summoned. To fail in readiness was to risk disgrace or loss of status, which meant the training never truly stopped. Most knights employed their own retainers, squires, foot soldiers, even archers. Maintaining this small-scale military unit required funding and constant drilling. They trained together, sparred, and patrolled estates, especially in times of unrest. Their presence wasn't just practical, it was psychological. Intimidation mattered. A knight's appearance, discipline, and reputation were weapons before any blade was drawn. Tournaments, while ceremonial in their later form, still involved lethal risk well into the 13th century. Knights trained not only for show, but to survive. The melee, the joust, and single combat were all tests of timing, strength, and nerve. Success brought prestige and sometimes financial reward. Defeat brought injury or humiliation. Lords often sponsored their knights in these events to display wealth and military readiness. Beyond tournaments and feudal service, knights were frequently hired as mercenaries. During the 100 Years' War and the Italian Condottieri conflicts, many knights sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. In between official campaigns, they participated in chevauchés' destructive raids meant to destabilize enemy regions. These raids blurred the line between military action and organized looting, and knights played a central role. The nobility depended on knights not just to fight, but to enforce control. Lords used them to collect taxes, punish defiance, and expand territory. Castles functioned as power centers because they housed armed, trained knights. Their loyalty was rarely moral. It was contractual, secured through land grants, marriages, or shared enemies. Knighthood, at its core, was not about honor or ceremony. It was about readiness, to fight, to kill, to serve. The business of violence never paused, because the social and political order demanded constant enforcement, and knights were the ones paid to provide it. Not every knight upheld the system that created him. For some, the training cracked. For others, it shattered completely. The medieval world documented these failures quietly, but they existed. Men who defied their oaths, turned against their lords, or collapsed under the psychological weight of lifelong conditioning. The training of a knight was meant to produce unwavering loyalty and discipline, but that conditioning often came at a cost. Rebellion, mental instability, and open defiance were not just rare anomalies. They were byproducts of a system that demanded absolute obedience while exposing men to constant violence, trauma, and internal contradiction. One of the most documented examples came from the early 14th century, the Templar trials. The Knights Templar, a military order sworn to poverty and obedience, had fought for over a century in the Crusades. But in 1307, King Philip IV of France accused them of heresy, and under torture, many confessed to blasphemy, sodomy, and treason. Whether the charges were true or fabricated, what mattered was the unraveling. These were elite, highly trained knights, and they broke under pressure. Some recanted, others stood firm. But the trial exposed that even the most rigidly conditioned warrior could be manipulated, coerced, or destroyed when the system turned on its own. There were also rogue knights, those who, after being trained for war, used their skills for personal gain or revenge. Sir Thomas Malory, the 15th century author of La Morte de Thor, was himself imprisoned multiple times for robbery, attempted murder, and extortion. His criminal behavior was not unique. Many disinherited or disgraced knights became brigands, mercenaries, or castle raiders. With no war to fight and no patron to serve, they reverted to violence, not as duty, but as survival. Mental trauma, though rarely diagnosed, was recognized. Chroniclers wrote of knights who withdrew from combat, who refused to fight, or who suffered from melancholia. After the Battle of Crécy in Aix-en-Sillil, some French knights reportedly abandoned the campaign altogether, unable to process the scale of defeat. The code of chivalry offered no room for vulnerability, yet the human cost of sustained warfare was undeniable. Some knights broke in quieter ways, through disobedience, defiance, or refusal to continue the cycle. Others were executed for insubordination, stripped of titles, or excommunicated. And some, like knights who joined heretical movements, such as the Hussites in Bohemia, turned against the very church and nobility they were meant to defend. These cases raise a deeper question. Was the knight ever truly in control? Or was he the end product of a machine, one that forged loyalty through violence, suppressed dissent through ritual, and defined worth by obedience? When that machine misfired, the results were rarely forgiven, only erased, condemned, or forgotten. Modern portrayals of knights often miss the mark. From films to children's books, the image has been polished into something almost noble, a protector in shining armor, bound by honor, saving the innocent and fighting only for justice. But the historical record tells a far more conflicted story. Knights were not idealized defenders. They were trained instruments of elite power, shaped by violence deployed for control and conditioned to obey. The romantic image owes much to 19th century nationalism and Victorian literature. Authors like Sir Walter Scott reimagined knighthood in books like Ivanhoe, painting it in the colors of chivalry, courtly love, and moral virtue. These narratives conveniently ignored the real behavior of medieval knights, men who routinely looted towns, enforced brutal feudal taxes, and fought wars for land, money, or status. By the time these stories reached popular culture, the medieval killer had been sanitized into a moral hero. The dissonance between myth and history runs deep. Consider the 100 Years' War, where English knights pillaged French countryside. In Chevauches's deliberate campaigns of terror aimed at civilians. Or the Crusades, where knights, supposedly fighting for salvation, committed mass killings in Jerusalem, Constantinople, and beyond. These actions were not aberrations. They were expected, sometimes celebrated. The code of chivalry, often cited as a moral framework, rarely extended to non-Christians, peasants, or political enemies. Mercy had limits. So did honor, yet the knightly legacy didn't vanish. Elements of their training and structure carried forward. Military academies across Europe in the early modern period adopted similar methods of discipline, hierarchy, and ritual. Prussian officer schools in the 18th century, for example, emphasized loyalty, obedience, and elite distinction, echoing the same psychological mold used to shape squires centuries earlier. Even West Point, founded in 1802, adopted symbolic codes of conduct rooted in chivalric tradition, despite functioning in a completely different era of warfare. What endured most, though, was the normalization of institutional violence, the idea that if it served the right authority, it was not only permissible but honorable. This principle, deeply embedded in the knightly class, outlived the armored warrior. It informed the structure of early police forces, colonial armies, and feudal-style militias. The appearance of discipline and nobility often masked systemic brutality. Knighthood as an institution faded by the 16th century, replaced by professional armies and gunpowder warfare. But the mindset survived the belief that lethal force, if ritualized and wrapped in loyalty, could be seen as virtue. That legacy remains difficult to untangle. Today, it fuels both admiration for historical heroism and a willful ignorance of the darker truths beneath the surface. The knight, as remembered today, is a myth crafted by those who needed killers, but preferred not to call them that. What remains is not just armor and legends, but a long shadow cast by a profession built on obedience, violence, and the illusion of honor.